Without further ado, please welcome Annie Laurie Gaylor.
Thank you. I'm going to make a few brief remarks and then introduce the panelists and get out of the way. But I did want to say that this room is full of people who could be on panels too. So if you haven't introduced yourself to your sister neighbor, I mean, we have the editor of the Humanist magazine here. We have Linda Lascola, a researcher working with Daniel Dennett on the Clergy Project. Catherine Dunphy, who's the secretary of the Clergy Project. This is helping atheist pastors in the closet get out. Jessica Alquist is here. So you never know who you're sitting next to. First, I wanted to throw out a couple of things. I think that some of our panelists are going to continue the discussion about the war against women. And to that end, some of you may have seen the "It's Time to Quit the Catholic Church" ad that ran in the New York Times in March, which I wrote and FFRF put out. And it's still creating shock waves. It came up at the stockholders meeting at the New York Times. And we decided to put it in the Washington Post May 2nd. And that doesn't have the national distribution, but the Catholic columnist Dion, I don't know how you say his name, went after it. And then today, the Ombudsman, Patrick Pexton, has a column, "Is the Post Anti-Catholic?" It's the Sunday column that comes out today. So that, I think, is the issue of feminism and state church of the day, the attack by the bishops and the fundamentalists against the right to contraception, attacking the contraceptive mandate. And then I think that we probably will also be touching on male domination of many of the conferences and why that happens and what to do about it. But each of our panelists has prepared some remarks, introductory remarks, and then we'll kind of, I guess, talk amongst ourselves and take questions. And I'm going to introduce all of them, and then they will proceed in order. Sikivu Hutchinson is Senior Intergroup Specialist for the Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission and Project Director of the Women's Leadership Project, a high school feminist mentoring program. She's the author of Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in Los Angeles, and Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics and the Values Wars, and the forthcoming Godless Americana, Race and Religious Rebels, which sounds fascinating. In 2010, she founded Black Skeptics Los Angeles. She will be followed by Rebecca Watson, who leads an international team of skeptical activists on the 6 sites that make up the Skeptic Network. Rebecca is also co-hosts the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, one of the most popular science podcasts in the world with more than 120,000 weekly listeners. She travels around the world delivering talks on science, atheism, feminism, and skepticism. And there is currently an asteroid orbiting the sun with her name on it. Then we'll hear from Ophelia Benson. She's a writer and blogger and runs a website called Butterflies and Wheels. That's been for 10 years. She has a blog of the same name that has moved to the Free Thought Blogs website. She's co-authored 3 books, all of them with Jeremy Stangroom: The Dictionary of Fashionable Nonsense, Why Truth Matters, and Does God Hate Women? I think we know the answer to that. She is associate editor of the Philosopher's Magazine. She's been doing that for 6 years, and she has a column there and also with Free Inquiry. And then we will hear from Jennifer McCreight. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
Jen blogs about atheism, feminism, science, and sex at BlagHag. She's a member of the Free Thought Blogs network. She's vice chair of the board of directors of the Secular Student Alliance and a contributor to the Atheist's Guide to Christmas. She was recently listed as one of More Magazine's top new feminists. Her day job is geeking out about human genetics and evolution as a PhD student at the University of Washington. And now we'll hear from Sikivu.
Good morning, good to be here.
Since this is the 20th anniversary of the LA civil unrest, aka the LA riots, the so-called Rodney King riots within mainstream media imagination, I'm going to frame my comments about the intersection of feminism and non-theism a little bit differently. I grew up in South LA in the 1970s and 1980s, and this was a period in which police terrorism against communities of color was more or less a fact of life, and it still is a fact of life. And this was a period in which the LAPD was led by a white supremacist named Daryl Gates that some of you older folk may be familiar with, the Daryl Gates regime. And Gates notoriously claimed that African Americans responded differently to chokeholds. And so this was one of the primary means of fascism during the Gates regime. And one of my first memories of going to a political protest as a child was in 1979 after the murder of an African American woman named Eula Love, who was killed by two LAPD police officers in her home after she allegedly wielded a knife at them. And my impressions of this murder really resonated deeply with me at the time because it was hard for me to believe as a child that this was a woman, a mother, who had been murdered in her own home. And in my child's mind, this was an atrocity because home was supposed to be safe space and private sanctuary. But the contradiction for African American women is that home historically has not been safe space and private sanctuary because of the ways in which African American women have been inscribed as less than human, as less than female, as sexualized, racially othered bodies for public control and consumption. And this obviously was articulated during the slave regime, whereby African American women's reproduction was strictly controlled to buttress the plantation economy. And this dynamic informs policies of mass incarceration that disproportionately lock up African American women at staggeringly egregious rates for nonviolent drug offenses, such that you have whole generations of young African Americans that are disproportionately assigned to foster care, that are homeless, and whole populations within our community that are disenfranchised from living wage employment. And so the question for me as an African American humanist feminist is, we cannot frame the so-called war on women strictly in terms of a Christian backlash against abortion rights and family planning if we are not looking at the degree to which women of color have been institutionally criminalized by policies of mass incarceration that intersect with the foreclosing of reproductive justice. So for example, this narrative that's emerged with a vengeance over the past couple of years that Black and Latino women in particular are dangerous breeders is informed by all of this fascistic fetal homicide and chemical endangerment policy that we've seen, over the past couple of years passed in Bible Belt states like Alabama and North Carolina and South Carolina that disproportionately criminalizes and targets pregnant African American and Latina and Asian women, as well as white working class women, has locked up scores of poor working class women on the grounds that the rights of the quote unquote fetus supersede those of the so-called criminal pathological drug using mother. And there have been national activists like the National Advocates for Pregnant Women that have really come at the barricades in looking at radical intersectionality. How do these policies, again, force and police women into these positions where their constitutional rights are fundamentally being abridged and basically gutted? Concomitant with that, there has been a House Republican subcommittee bill that was submitted last year that would prohibit so-called race selection abortions. And this is public policy that was trotted out in Georgia, and fortunately was smacked down by the Georgia state legislature. But it's based on this propaganda that somehow abortion is a leading cause of death for African Americans. And this is rhetoric that was marshaled by a national billboard campaign that was funded by far-right radical groups, the Latino Conservative Partnership and the Radiance Foundation. And these billboards were placed in urban cities throughout the nation. And the tagline was that the most dangerous place for a Black or Latino child was in the womb of Black and Latino irresponsible breeder mothers. And some of you may be familiar with these billboards. They're placed in New York, in Atlanta, in LA, et cetera. So this kind of propaganda